There is a white crystal sitting in your kitchen right now that has killed more people than most wars. You stir it into your coffee without a second thought. You bake it into birthday cakes. You give it to children as a treat. It seems harmless, innocent, pure, but this crystal has a body count. For most of human history, sugar was not a food. It was a medicine, a luxury, and a symbol of unimaginable wealth. There was a time when it was worth more than gold by weight, when kings displayed it to prove their power, and when a single spoonful cost more than a laborer earned in a week. And to feed the world's growing hunger for it, human beings built one of the most brutal systems ever devised. Sugar did not just sweeten our food. It reshaped continents. It emptied Africa of millions of people. It built the fortunes of empires and the great cities of Europe. It rewired the human body itself, in ways we are only now beginning to understand. The story of sugar is the story of pleasure and suffering bound together so tightly they can never be separated. Every crystal carries both. This is the hidden history of sugar, where it truly came from, the empires that fought over it, the millions who died producing it, and how a rare medicine became the cheapest, most consumed, and most dangerous substance on your plate. And almost none of it is on the label. Our story begins not in a kitchen, but in a swamp. Around 10,000 years ago, on the tropical island of New Guinea, people began chewing a tall, fibrous grass. When they bit into the stalk and crushed it between their teeth, something extraordinary happened. A sweet juice flooded their mouths. This grass was wild sugarcane, and it would become one of the most sought-after plants on earth. At first, cane was simply chewed for its juice. There were no crystals, no white powder, just a sweet reed passed from island to island across the Pacific, then carried west into Southeast Asia and eventually to India. And it was in India that everything changed. Somewhere around 2,000 years ago, Indian craftsmen discovered how to boil the cane juice, reduce it, and let it dry into solid grains. For the first time, the sweetness could be captured, stored, and carried. They called these grains kanda, a word that would travel across languages and become our word candy. To the ancient world, this was close to magic. Sweetness that did not rot, did not spoil, and could be traded across vast distances. Sanskrit texts described it as a precious medicine used to treat illness and restore strength. Travelers wrote in astonishment of a reed that produced honey without any bees. When the armies of the ancient Mediterranean reached India, they carried the story home. But the plant itself needed heat, water, and endless labor to grow, and for centuries it stayed locked in the East. Then came the great expansion of the Arab world. As Arab traders and scholars spread across the Middle East and North Africa, they carried sugarcane with them, and with it, a genius for cultivation. They built sophisticated irrigation systems to water the thirsty crop. They refined the boiling process into an art. They established the first true sugar plantations from Persia to Egypt to Sicily and southern Spain. Wherever sugar went, wealth followed. And in the shaded workshops of the Islamic world, a rare luxury began, slowly, to take shape as a global commodity. But it was still impossibly expensive, and the people of Europe had barely tasted it. When European knights marched east during the Crusades, they were fighting a holy war. But they came home with something that would change their world far more than any battle: a taste for sugar. In the markets of the Levant, the Crusaders encountered this astonishing sweet powder, and they were entranced. One chronicler described sugar as a most precious product, very necessary for the use and health of mankind. They carried it back to a continent that had known only honey, and Europe fell in love. But this was a love only the rich could afford. For centuries, sugar in Europe was not something you ate. It was something you displayed. It arrived from the east in hard cones, weighed out by the ounce, locked away like jewels. Apothecaries sold it as medicine, prescribing it for coughs, fevers, and weak stomachs. It was dusted onto food to prove that the host was wealthy enough to waste it. At royal banquets, sugar became theatre. Master confectioners sculpted it into towering centerpieces called subtleties. Entire castles, ships, animals, and saints molded from sugar paste and paraded before astonished guests. Kings gave sugar sculptures as gifts to rival kings. To own sugar was to announce without saying a word that you stood at the very top of the world, and the obsession left its mark, quite literally, on the people who could afford it. When Queen Elizabeth I of England smiled, her teeth were black with decay, rotted by her relentless love of sweets. Foreign visitors noted it with alarm, and yet, rather than being ashamed, wealthy Europeans began deliberately blackening their teeth to imitate her so that everyone would know they too could afford sugar. Think about that. Rotting teeth had become a status symbol. Meanwhile, the trade grew. The city of Venice built a fortune refining raw sugar and selling it across Europe at staggering markups. Sugar refineries, hot and dangerous, sprang up in the great port cities. Every year the demand climbed higher, and every year Europe wanted more than the old plantations of the Mediterranean could possibly supply. The hunger was becoming bottomless, and soon men would cross an ocean to feed it, carrying sugarcane to a new world and building something monstrous to grow it. In 1493, on his second voyage across the Atlantic, Christopher Columbus carried something in the hold of his ship that would prove more consequential than gold: cuttings of sugarcane. He planted them in the Caribbean, and the plant that had crawled slowly across the world for 10,000 years suddenly found its perfect home. The islands were hot, wet, and endless. Sugarcane exploded across them. The Europeans had discovered that the New World could grow sugar on a scale the Old World could never match. And a race began, a race for the sweetest and most profitable crop on Earth. The Portuguese moved first, building plantations on the islands off Africa, then transplanting the whole system to the vast coast of Brazil. The Spanish followed in the Caribbean, then the Dutch, the English, and the French, seizing island after island and turning them one by one into engines of sugar. Small tropical islands you have barely heard of became some of the most valuable real estate on the planet. When France and Britain later sat down to negotiate, France would give up nearly all of Canada to keep a single tiny sugar island. That is how much sugar was worth. But growing sugar was not like growing wheat. It was closer to running a factory than a farm. The cane had to be cut by hand in the brutal tropical heat, and it had to be crushed within hours before it spoiled. So on every plantation stood a mill where great rollers pressed the juice from the stalks, and beside it a boiling house where the juice was cooked down in a line of roaring copper cauldrons, hotter than a forge, day and night during the harvest. This was one of the first true industrial processes in human history, a relentless, dangerous, round-the-clock system that turned green cane into white crystal. Historians have called the sugar plantation a proto-factory, a preview of the industrial world to come. It devoured everything: wood to feed the fires, land cleared to the horizon, and above all, it devoured people. Enormous numbers of people worked without rest to keep the mills turning and the cauldrons boiling. The demand in Europe was insatiable. The islands could produce the supply. There was only one question left: who would do the labor? And the answer to that question would become one of the greatest crimes in human history. To understand what sugar truly cost, you have to follow it back across the ocean. The plantations needed labor on a scale that no free workforce could ever provide. The work was too hard, too hot, and too deadly. No one would choose it. And so the men who ran the sugar islands turned to the most brutal solution imaginable. They bought human beings. Over the course of the Atlantic slave trade, roughly 12 million African men, women, and children were forced onto ships and carried to the Americas. And more of them, by far, were sent to grow sugar than any other crop. Sugar was the hungriest. Sugar took the most. The ships crossed in what became known as the Middle Passage, a voyage of such horror that many did not survive it. Those who did arrived in a world designed to consume them. On the sugar plantations, life was measured in years, not lifetimes. The labor in the fields and the boiling houses was so relentless and the conditions so cruel that enslaved people died faster than children were born. The plantations could not sustain their own population. They simply ordered more people from across the sea to replace those they had worked to death. This was not an accident of the system. It was the system, an entire economy spanning 3 continents, built to turn human lives into sweetness. Historians call it the triangular trade. Ships carried manufactured goods from Europe to Africa. They carried enslaved people from Africa to the Americas. And they carried sugar and the rum distilled from it back to Europe, where it was sold at enormous profit. Round and round, the same ships, the same routes for generations. The wealth it generated built banks, financed industries, and raised the grand houses and harbors of Europe's great cities. The crystal in the sugar bowl and the chains in the ship's hold were 2 ends of a single chain. On one island, Saint-Domingue, the richest sugar colony of them all, the enslaved would eventually rise up in the only successful slave revolution in history and win their freedom in blood and fire. But across the wider world, the machinery of sugar and slavery ground on for centuries. We remember the sweetness. We forget the price. But the price was paid by millions of people whose names we will never know. And it was paid so that a continent an ocean away could stir something sweet into its tea. By the 1700s, sugar was everywhere in Europe, and a strange new idea was taking hold, that the sweetness in the cup might be stained by the suffering that produced it. In Britain, a remarkable thing happened. Ordinary people began to refuse sugar. Abolitionists printed pamphlets urging families to boycott slave-grown sugar, calling it blood sugar. They argued that every spoonful was soaked in cruelty. Hundreds of thousands of people stopped buying it. Some shops began selling sugar, labeled as produced by free labor, one of the first ethical consumer movements in history. For the first time, people were asked to think about where their sweetness came from, and many did not like the answer. The pressure grew alongside slave revolts and shifting economics, until at last the British Empire abolished the slave trade and then slavery itself. Other nations slowly followed. The old system that had built the sugar islands began, finally, to fall apart. But the world's appetite for sugar did not fall with it. If anything, it was about to explode. Because a new source had appeared, one that did not need tropical islands at all. Deep in an ordinary root vegetable, the humble beet, chemists discovered the very same sugar found in cane. When wars cut Europe off from the Caribbean, the Emperor Napoleon poured resources into the beet, and a vast new sugar industry took root in the cold fields of Europe itself. Now sugar could be grown almost anywhere. And as the Industrial Revolution roared to life, steam-powered refineries turned it out by the ton, purer and whiter and cheaper than ever before. The price collapsed. The luxury that had once been locked away like gold became something anyone could buy by the bag. Great companies rose to feed the demand, refining and packaging sugar for the masses. It poured into jams and biscuits, into tea and cheap treats for factory workers, a quick source of energy for the hungry engines of industry. Sugar stopped being a symbol of wealth and became a fuel for the working world. In just a few generations, sugar had gone from a medicine weighed out by the ounce to a commodity measured by the shipload. It had conquered the entire world. And now, cheap and abundant and everywhere, it was about to enter our bodies in quantities no human being had ever consumed before. That is where the final chapter of this story begins. 100 years ago, the average person ate a small fraction of the sugar we eat today. Now, sugar is in almost everything we buy, and much of it is hidden where we would never think to look. It is in your bread, your pasta sauce, your salad dressing, your yogurt, your breakfast cereal, marketed as healthy. Food companies learned that sugar does something powerful. It makes almost anything more appealing, more comforting, harder to put down. And so they added it again and again to products that were never meant to be sweet. The result has been a transformation of the human diet, unlike anything in our history, and our bodies have struggled to keep up. Rates of obesity, of type 2 diabetes, of heart disease have climbed together across the modern world, and a growing mountain of evidence points back to the white crystal we consume in such staggering amounts. And here the old pattern of sugar returns one final time. Because just as the truth about slave-grown sugar was once hidden from the public, the truth about sugar and health was hidden too. In the 20th century, as scientists began to suspect that sugar was harming us, the sugar industry quietly funded research to shift the blame elsewhere, steering the conversation toward fat and away from sugar for decades. Documents uncovered years later revealed how the science had been shaped. By the time the truth came fully to light, sugar was woven so deeply into our food and our habits that pulling it back out has proven almost impossible. So here we are. The same substance that was once a sacred medicine in ancient India, that kings displayed like treasure, that emptied Africa of millions of lives, that built empires and toppled them, now sits, cheap and forgotten, at the bottom of nearly every package on the shelf. Sugar is perhaps the most successful and most costly thing humanity has ever craved. It has been a medicine, a luxury, a weapon, and a poison. It has carried both the greatest pleasure and the greatest cruelty of our history in the very same crystal. The next time you stir a spoonful into your cup and watch it dissolve and disappear, remember everything it took to put it there. Because that quiet, ordinary sweetness is the most extraordinary story in your kitchen, and almost none of it is on the label.